Welcome, Professor. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Professor Peter, could you please, first of all, before I say anything, it's an honor and it's a privilege to be sitting with you in your company and having this conversation and going through and traversing a long years of history. But before we go to the history part of it, could I ask you to share your background, your backdrop, and your landing into the work you did in the history world?
Sure. Thanks, Dave. It's a very great pleasure to be here with you. I'm a British migrant to Australia. We arrived in 1966 and
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in South Australia, a place called Wyalla. I was always interested in history. And as a teenager, I read a book. I read many books about history, but one of them was Byron Farwell's Queen Victoria's Little
Mm-hmm.
Wars, which was basically about the drama of in British Indian military history. And I was entranced by this. It was a very different world to the one I was living in. And I continued to be interested in it even after I became a professional historian. And although I was mostly working an historian of Australian military history, I always maintained an interest in British India, and in fact did my PhD on British Indian military history in the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I went to UNSW Canberra, I was basically able to research what I liked because I was a research professor,
Mm-hmm.
so I didn't do much teaching. And what I really was interested in was British India. So I wrote a number of books, several books, 4 books, I think, on British India, military history of the First World War and the 19th century. But the first one I did, well, I went back to an interest I'd had since the early 1980s when I first discovered that there were Indian troops on Gallipoli when I was working at the Australian War Memorial, where I worked for 27 years. And I realized that I long realized that there was a book to be written about the Indians on Gallipoli because nobody else had.
Mm-hmm.
Extraordinarily,
Mm-hmm.
in a century, nobody had written a book about the Indians who served on Gallipoli.
Wow.